Alright, in this section, we're going to look at the impact of democracy on South African society. So how has democracy worked out for them in the last 20 years or so? And if you can take a look at this cartoon, you can see Mandela really is the peak, and there have been some serious problems with his successors. So in 3 videos, we'll look at economic and social policies, results of those policies, as well as the cultural impact of democracy. So let's start with the economic and social policies of democracy in the last 20 years or so. Okay, starting with policies to address the distribution of wealth. Black community had very high expectations. They wanted a lot from this new government because they'd just been ignored for so long. So they expected to get land, water, electricity, houses, clinics, schools, and jobs. They wanted the government to actually listen to them and work for them and not against them as it had in the past. Their economy had been weakened for the last 50 years by the economic sanctions of the planet, isolationist economic policies of the apartheid government, as well as the extreme cost of defending apartheid and keeping up military costs to hold the population down. And this cost so much money that they ran into significant debt, so they owed money and they ruined their economy. So it's a lot of work to do. Their first attempt is the Reconstruction and Development Program, RDP. It's a socio-economic, and so social and economic plan to restructure society and redistribute wealth based on socialist ideals. So it's a bit socialist, and then it's definitely targeting the poor and wants to, the idea of taking from the rich and giving to the poor a little bit. So they plan to build 300,000 new houses. They want to provide clean water, sanitation and electricity, have better health care, education, and welfare services. Very simple things, but complicated to provide for that. It's based on the idea that they came up in the 50s on the Freedom Charter, calling for state ownership of key sectors of the economy that the government can control it better. But eventually the ANC gets rid of these plans. They see it as too socialistic. It's not going to work. And they get rid of the plans to nationalize certain businesses, despite pleas from the Communist Party and the unions. Overall, this program was unrealistic and just didn't have the money to go through and build quite enough. So they do change up their plans into GEAR, so from RDP into GEAR. The new Minister of Finance, here he is, and here he is as well there, Trevor Manuel. He announces a plan for economic growth based on capitalist ideas. So they move from a socialist-style economy into a capitalist-style economy, to the Growth, Employment, and Reconstruction Program, or GEAR program. And so instead of having the government take over, it's quite the opposite. They're going to do privatization of state businesses, so that means government-run businesses will be given over to regular people to run because maybe they can do it cheaper and better. And so they really embrace capitalism to encourage foreign investment, to increase exports to the global economy, because more investors are going to come in if they have the chance to make money. And so this kind of opens that opportunity up for them to make money. And so he's got some big plans. However, he's got some serious problems when it comes to dealing with the government. Sometimes there's corruption in the government that he has to deal with. The hope is that this is going to increase jobs, provide more economic growth, and raise revenue for more government programs so they can raise more money to spend on their people. The government was still spending a lot of money on their people. 48% of their 98-99 budget was spent on social services like education, health, welfare, and housing. So they were already spending a lot of money. They need to raise the money to afford that. The Communist Party and the unions were quite angered by this policy because they thought it would just cause more inequality. They felt, as this funny little cartoon, they felt that this was working against the Freedom Charter and really hurting the goals of the ANC from the 1950s. Overall results, it's mixed. Foreign investment did increase, but not really as much as they hoped. So they got more money, but not quite to a level that they really hoped for. Their poorly skilled workers and low productivity really slowed economic growth and discouraged investments. So they're trying to have an post-industrial economy, but that requires a college education, and they just don't have the workers with that education at this point. So these South African companies are just not ready to produce for a global market on a massive scale. It's going to take a lot of work to go from just producing within your country to producing for the world. But overall, the economy did stabilize, and they slowly began to grow. They got a long way to go. As far as unemployment, Very high levels of unemployment faced this new government, and there historically was an uneven pattern of employment along racial lines, and there continues to be. And so you can see this chart based on 2006, with the average unemployment being between, depending if you're looking at the official numbers or the unofficial numbers, but let's look at the unofficial numbers because they're scarier. And so on average, the unemployment rate is probably closer to 36%, but the African unemployment rate is 42%, and the white unemployment rate is 8%. So some serious flaws, some of the roots of racism still there, but it also has to do with education. Because of a poor education system for Africans in the past, they're not able to get the best jobs, so they have to fix education first. The RDP and the GEAR hoped to reduce unemployment, but they just didn't get results. As of 2000, the union blamed GEAR, claiming that 500,000 jobs had been lost since the ANC took over, so things were getting worse, according to the unions. As of 2001, the unemployment rate was at 41.6. Not included was the estimated 20% of labor that's informal. This means people selling things out of their houses, but not necessarily paying taxes for it or recording it. Unions and labor. Labor under apartheid included a lot of discrimination against the unions, repression and holding back the unions, as well as very authoritarian management, the boss really not being fair. The new government, influenced by COSATU, established a couple programs to help out workers. So they start with NEDLAC, the National Economic Development and Labor Council. And so the government, the unions, and businesses will all be represented equally in this place for them to talk instead of fight. And the goal is coordinating economic, labor, and social policies, so they're all going to work together for the good of the worker. In 1995, right off the bat, they passed a couple laws to help workers. The Labor Relations Act, which includes some other little bits. And the goal there is to resolve past problems resulting in workers' strikes. They want to have less strikes, they want to have better rights for their workers, and better working conditions as well. So they established the Council of Conciliation, Mediation, and Arbitration, CCMA, to resolve industrial disputes. So it's an organization to help talk things out as opposed to going straight to strike. They set up a labor court to help interpret the application of this law. In 1998, they heard 81,000 cases, mostly about unfair dismissal of workers. And again, this is all meant to prevent strikes. So they spend a little money on these courts, but they make more money by keeping the workers working. This does encourage the growth of trade unions, because trade unions are showing that they're strong. As of 1998, 75% of registered workers belong to a union. However, those are only registered workers, so that doesn't include farmers, domestic workers, or informal workers. So there's still some work to go on that. However, it works in that the number of strikes does decline. More on labor. Overall, you get a couple other great laws. The Basic Conditions of Employment Act of 97. We get new regulations for hours of work, better regulations for minimum wages, as well as better working conditions. The Employment Equity Act of 98 aimed to reverse discrimination by nominating blacks, women, and disabled workers for employment. So this is a bit of affirmative action. And so offering them first pick at those jobs. They have to be qualified at those jobs, but they're looking for qualified candidates that are black, qualified candidates that are women, qualified candidates that are disabled. They're not getting the job just because they're black. And they have to be qualified as well. And so they start to put pressure on companies with over 50 workers to ensure that they have the numbers representative of the population. And so it helps a little bit, but it does bring about a bit of jealousy in some ways, the same way it does in America. And it does help a bit, but there's a long way to go. Looking at these unemployment rates compared to 94 to 2011, it's gotten a little bit better, but not that much. Social welfare. So before 94, 2.4 million people were receiving some form of Social Security. However, that was mostly white people. So the new government wanted to fix some things and extend that to all of its population. And so the new government guaranteed everybody has the right to Social Security, this kind of safety net, so that if you're about to die, the government's going to step up and help you out. And so it's not financially possible to provide the same level of benefits to all at the level given to whites. And whites were taking a lot of the amount of money given out. So they had to equalize that a bit, so that means less money for those whites, and so that everybody can have a piece of Social Security. And so if you can't support yourselves, this is the government stepping up to help out. So this is old age pensions. You didn't save for retirement, you can't work, and so you might die. This is child support, going to take care of kids that are having serious problems. Foster care, disability grants, care dependency grants. And so this chart kind of shows all the different ways that it's going to help out people. In these different forms. Pensions were increased over time, and eventually child support was included as well. It's very difficult to maintain, however. When the unemployment rate drops, they just don't have the money because people aren't paying in the taxes if they don't have a job. Education. Before 94, education was a mess, and after 94, it's a little bit better. There were 15 separate education departments, one for each race, province, and homeland. The black schools were terrible. They were overcrowded, underfunded, and the teachers were unqualified, and the buildings were just falling apart. Legal segregation ends in 1994, but it's going to take a while to get rid of cultural segregation because a lot of these schools are still all black, all white. Very few black students were able to attend, and still, very few black students are moving into these former all-white schools. They're still mostly all-white schools. Plus, right afterwards, the black schools really never recovered from the boycott of the 80s. People were walking out of classes. The idea was to have liberation before actually education. And so the schools were a mess in the 80s, and so an entire generation just didn't get educated in the 80s, and it really affected afterwards, especially their employment, and that they just didn't get that high school education. They set up one National Department of Education with a new curriculum. So it's one curriculum overall, no separation according to race. They built up thousands of new schools, mostly in the homelands where they're necessary. Class sizes are reduced. Primary education, that means elementary schools, becomes mandatory, so they get more education to get better jobs in the long run. And they increase the budget of the schools significantly. More reforms. Despite these reforms, restructuring and funding improvement, they got a ways to go. A lot of the schools that were chaotic in the 80s were going to be chaotic in the 90s. There was a massive teacher shortage, especially in math and science, and because throughout the 1980s, high school pretty much stopped, resulting in major problems when it comes to the next generation of teachers. The shortage gets worse in 1996 when teachers accept retirement packages from the government to reduce costs. So the government wants to save some money, so they encourage teachers to retire, and they just don't get new teachers. So their exam scores go down without enough teachers and with chaos in the classroom. They go from 58% passing in 94 to 49% passing in 98. And you can see the breakdown according to race as far as those passing the high school exit exam. And so we got some serious problems. When it comes especially the African schools in the 1980s, they haven't caught up yet. 80% of African students did not speak English as their home language, so they needed to worry about language. Before 93, their home language was used until the 5th grade, and then English began. After 94, most schools, because of parent demand, said, no, start my kid on English. English needs to be the #1 priority here. So they're moving away from the Bantu education. School improvements, they're pretty slow in the rural areas. As of 2002, 28% of schools had no running water, 43% no electricity, and 78% of schools had no libraries. So they got a ways to go, especially when it comes to violence outside the classroom, sometimes in the classroom. Health. Under apartheid, there was a lot of disparity or split in provision and quality of healthcare. The city hospitals were very well funded, provided high quality healthcare for whites. The rural hospitals for blacks were terrible. And so the new government focus shifted from curative medicines and very expensive technology instead to focus on preventing disease in the first place. So spending a little bit of money on shots to avoid a very expensive surgery in the long run. So the RDP reduced funding to the big city hospitals to help build clinics in the poor areas. So to overall reduce all sickness as opposed to spending a whole bunch of money on taking care of somebody when they're already sick. So the idea is preventing disease. Okay, speaking of disease, here comes AIDS. The first cases in Africa started in the early 1980s. Uganda and Tanzania, is really Central Africa, became the center of the first epidemic. 800,000 Ugandans were HIV positive in the 1980s, and the disease spread around Africa according to trucking routes as different countries were trading. This was helped by the movement of migrant workers as they would move across borders, refugees, and soldiers wherever they moved, and they're bringing along AIDS and spreading it. As of 1990, the HIV arrives in South Africa, starting with blood tests of pregnant women in the Zulu, KwaZulu-Natal. The apartheid government and the interim government didn't do anything to really stop this. They didn't know how to react. But the Americans didn't know how to react. Nobody knew how to react in the 80s. But by the 1990s, we start to figure out these strategies, but South Africa was a little slow to the game here. Mandela, this is one of Mandela's failures. Yeah, he failed a little bit. Mandela didn't really focus on AIDS awareness while he was president. He did this after his presidency, but it can be considered one of his failures that he didn't really stop this in its tracks. And so you can start to see the percentage of deaths caused by AIDS. So this is the percentage of everybody dying, with 30% of all deaths in South Africa just connected to AIDS. So it's a serious problem, especially in the poorer states. And the more wealthy white states, they don't have a higher rate. But it's a lot of the poor states that aren't getting the education, aren't getting condoms, things like that, where it's spreading. Thabo Mbeki, Mandela's kind of deputy president, argued that AIDS just wasn't a thing. AIDS was a Western disease and that there was a racist agenda about reports of AIDS in Africa. And so because it was such a problem in Africa, he figured that it was just a conspiracy of the whites against Africans. He even questions the effectiveness of antiretroviral drugs to stop the spread, to stop HIV from going into full AIDS, claiming they were toxic drugs and they were just sold by pharmaceutical companies to make money and they wouldn't actually help you. Once president, Mbeki appoints a health minister who refuses to allow hospitals to even supply these drugs that were already working in Uganda. He also appointed an AIDS advisory panel that included scientists that believed that HIV didn't cause AIDS. And so the rate of infection got worse, and it really impacts young adults the most, resulting in a very weak labor force, hurting the economy, putting pressure on health clinics, and you get more and more children dependent on Social Security because their parents are dying of AIDS. And plus, if the children have AIDS, we have to have more in healthcare, so serious problems resulting in this. As of 2000, AIDS is a pandemic proportion, 4.2 million infected in South Africa, making it the worst country on the planet when it comes to HIV. Policies affecting minorities. After a history of racial discrimination against minorities, whites feared that they would be discriminated against by this new government. And Mandela says, no, we're going to be all together in a new rainbow nation, where we're all together. The ANC government followed the non-racial policy outlined in the Freedom Charter of '95, with a Bill of Rights that just included everybody. So everyone's equal according to race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, ethnic or social origin, color, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, conscious belief, culture, language, and birth. Everybody's equal. They'll establish a Human Rights Commission as well, and a Commission for the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Cultural, Religious, and Linguistic Communities to protect minority rights. So the government says a whole lot when it comes to equality. And so I think the whites were scared, but really it's not much. They weren't really impacted too much. Despite a commitment to non-racialism and equality for all, the civil service, the government workers, really needed to be restructured. Because when they started, the government bureaucracy had 2.5 million civil servants or workers, and that's mostly white men. So they needed to make a change to make it more of a rainbow nation, not just a white male nation. So they opened up 11,000 new affirmative action jobs, advertised to include. They must be qualified, but they're also looking for race and gender to be part of it too. They encourage a lot of these white guys to retire, so early retirement packages, they get a lot of people out of them. And so 117,000 retire by 2002. And between 94 and 99, jobs held by whites dropped from 44% to 18%. So a lot of them are retiring, or in some cases moving out of the country. The government also tries to get more black businesses going, and through the BE, the Black Economic Empowerment. And this was aimed to increase black ownership and control of companies and make loans readily available. As far as women, the new Constitution promotes gender equality and guarantees the rights of freedom from unfair discrimination. And so the Bill of Rights looked out for women as well. They included grounds for discrimination specific to women, including pregnancy, marital status, sexual orientation, age, disability, all impacting women. So black women become the main focus of these affirmative action policies. They needed the most help. The Commission on Gender Equality was set up to promote equality in all spheres of society with a focus on the most disadvantaged women. As of 95, the UN had a meeting on women, and so the South Africans set up a committee to make sure that the goals of that meeting will go through. And so they start strategies to improve the lives of women affected by poverty, violence, and HIV/AIDS. One example is the Working for Water project to help clear vegetation in water catchment areas. They were required to give 50% of their jobs to women, so more jobs to help more women. The ANC also applied a quota for women representatives in the government to increase. And we'll stop there.